What if I told you that the most important battle in British history began not with a bugle call but with the rustle of silk and the popping of champagne corks? Imagine a room filled with the elite of Europe dancing the night away in Brussels, while just miles away a monster was scratching at the door. If you value grit, accuracy, and the stories of the men who built the world we live in today, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We're going deep into the archives, and I don't want you to miss a single second of this journey. It is June 15th, 1815. The Duchess of Richmond is hosting the most brilliant ball in history, but as the violins play, a mud-spattered messenger pushes through the crowd. He hands a dispatch to a tall, hawk-nosed man with a resolute gaze. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. He reads the note, his face a mask of iron, and whispers to his host, "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God. He's gained 24 hours' march on me." You see, the Iron Duke had been caught napping. Napoleon Bonaparte, the scrubby Corsican himself, had achieved the impossible. He had vanished from his exile on Elba and reappeared in France like a phantom. Within weeks, his old veterans, the men who had bled for him from Moscow to Madrid, had flocked back to his golden eagles. Now, he was lunging through the forest of Soignies, aiming a dagger straight at the heart of the Allied coalition. Napoleon's plan was a tactical masterclass. He knew he couldn't fight the whole world at once, so he chose to strike the hinge. He wanted to drive a massive wedge between Wellington's Anglo-Allied force and Marshal Blucher's Prussians. If he could keep them apart, he could destroy them one by one. And for a moment, it looked like it was working. While Wellington was charming ladies in a ballroom, Napoleon's scarlet caterpillar of an army was already crawling across the border at Charleroi. To put this in perspective for you, the cost of mobilizing those troops today would be upwards of £2 billion. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was the ultimate high-stakes gamble for the soul of Europe. Wellington knew that if the French took the crossroads at Quatre Bras, his army would be sliced off from his Prussian allies. He had to move. Now, the Duke, as he was known to his men, didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply finished his supper, told his officers to keep their spirits up, and quietly slipped away. By dawn, the streets of Brussels were no longer filled with the sound of music, but with the rhythmic, heavy thud of thousands of boots. The Redcoats were marching. The myth often tells us that Wellington was a perfect, untouchable genius. But the truth is much more human. He was human. He was surprised, and he was very nearly defeated before the first shot was even fired. He had to rely on the sheer grit of his subordinates to hold the line while he scrambled to fix his mistake. Today, when you stand in the middle of London's Waterloo station, you are standing in a monument to this moment of crisis. We name our greatest landmarks after this battle, not because it was easy, but because it was so really close to being a disaster. Wellington's false start reminds us that history isn't made by men who never fail. It's made by men who, when they find themselves in a hole, stop digging and start fighting. The stage was set. The nemesis was at the gate, and the next 48 hours would decide whether the 19th century belonged to a French emperor or a British duke. The ball was over. The butcher's bill was about to be presented. In every great conflict, there is a moment where the armies fade into the background, and the story becomes a duel between two singular minds. At Waterloo, it wasn't just France versus Britain. It was the ogre versus the aristocrat. Napoleon Bonaparte and Arthur Wellesley were born in the very same year, 1769. Yet, they lived in two entirely different universes. Napoleon was the ultimate self-made man, a lightning bolt from Corsica who had torn up the rulebook of the old world. He had fought over 80 battles, and he had won almost all of them. To his soldiers, he wasn't just a general. He was a deity in a grey overcoat. When he walked among them, his presence alone was said to be worth 40,000 men on the field. He was a master of the grand gesture, a man who crowned himself emperor because no one else was worthy of the task. Then, you have Wellington. The Iron Duke was the complete opposite. He was a product of the British establishment. Cold, aloof, and meticulously professional. Cold, aloof, and meticulously professional. While Napoleon was a creature of passion and grand strategy, Wellington was a master of logistics. He once famously said that the secret of war was knowing what was on the other side of the hill. He didn't care for glory or the adoration of his troops. In fact, he famously called his own men the scum of the earth, though he followed that by saying it was really wonderful what a set of fine fellows we have made of them. To understand the scale of what these two men were managing, you have to look at the machines of war in 1815. The primary tool of the infantry was the Brown Bess musket. It was heavy, it was temperamental, and it was wildly inaccurate. If you wanted to hit a target at 100 yards, you didn't aim, you prayed. This is why the battles were so intimate and so terrifying. You had to stand shoulder to shoulder with your mates, waiting until you could see the whites of their enemies' eyes before unleashing a volley. Let's talk about the money, because the who is nothing without the how. To put an army of 72,000 men in the field in 1815, as Napoleon did, required a staggering amount of capital. We are talking about the modern equivalent of nearly £110 for every single pound spent back then. The logistics of feeding those men, shoeing the horses, and hauling the massive brass cannons through the thick Belgian mud was a Herculean task. It was a factory of death that required constant fueling. Napoleon's military machine was built on speed. He moved his men faster than anyone thought possible. But Wellington? Wellington's machine was built on resilience. He was the ultimate defensive boxer. He had spent years in Spain and Portugal perfecting the reverse slope tactic. He would hide his men behind the crest of a hill, keeping them safe from the French artillery, only to have them stand up at the last second and pour lead into the stunned French columns. It was a clash of philosophies. Napoleon was the master of the attack, a man who believed in the knockout blow. Wellington was the master of the counterpunch, a man who believed in outlasting his opponent. Even their personal quirks tell the story. Napoleon was known for his frantic energy, often moving maps around on the floor and screaming orders at his marshals. Wellington was the picture of British grit. He sat on his horse, Copenhagen, for 15 hours straight during the battle, calmly snacking on a piece of cold chicken while cannonballs whistled over his head. There is a modern connection here that is often overlooked. We see these two figures as statues in parks, but their DNA literally shaped the modern world. Take the famous Winston Churchill. He was a direct descendant of the Duke of Marlborough, but his entire military worldview was shaped by studying the duel between Wellington and Napoleon. He saw it as the ultimate template for how Britain must stand against a continental tyrant. The stage was now set. The ogre had the momentum, but the aristocrat had the position. Napoleon looked at Wellington and saw a sepoy general, a man who had only learned to fight in India and didn't belong on a European stage. He told his marshals, "I tell you Wellington is a bad general. The English are bad general, the English are bad troops, and this affair is nothing more than eating breakfast." He couldn't have been more wrong. What Napoleon failed to realize was that Wellington wasn't just fighting for territory. He was fighting for a system. He was the resolute wall against which the Napoleonic wave was about to crash. The scrubby Corsican was about to meet the one man who wouldn't blink, the one man who had never been defeated. As the sun began to set on the 17th of June, the rain began to fall. It wasn't just a drizzle. It was a deluge. It turned the fields of Waterloo into a swamp, a thick, sucking mire that would dictate the fate of empires the following day. The machines of war, the heavy cannons and the thundering cavalry were about to be tested by the very earth itself. The two giants were finally in the same arena. No more letters, no more maneuvers, just two men, two systems, and a ridge that would soon be soaked in the blood of 50,000 souls. To understand why Waterloo was such a near-run thing, we have to look at the 3 days before the first shot was fired at Mont Saint-Jean. Napoleon was playing a game of high-stakes chess, and his opening move was a masterpiece called the central position. Imagine a giant V. Wellington's army is at the top left. The Prussian army under Marshal Blucher is at the top right. Napoleon's goal? To drive himself right up into the middle, creating a rotten wedge that would force the two allies apart. On the 15th of June, he did exactly that. He crossed the border at Charleroi with a speed that left the Allied scouts blinking in disbelief. He didn't just march, he lunged. By the morning of the 16th, the French army had split into 2 wings like the claws of a lobster. One claw, under Marshal Ney, moved to grab the vital crossroads at Quatre Bras. The other, led by the Emperor himself, took aim at the Prussians at a little village called Ligny. Now, let's talk about the nemesis factor. In every documentary we focus on the French and the British, but we often forget the old lion of the north, Gebhard le Berghecht von Blücher. This man was 72 years old. He didn't just hate Napoleon. He considered him Apollyon. He considered him a personal affront to the universe. Blücher was a wild, gin-drinking, tobacco-chewing hussar who once claimed he had been impregnated by a French soldier and was going to give birth to an elephant. He was, quite frankly, mad as a hatter. But he was also as tough as old boots. At Ligny, Napoleon caught the Prussians in a brutal, slugging match. The fighting was house to house, bayonet to bayonet. There was no room for tactical elegance in the narrow streets of the village. It was a bloodbath. As the sun began to dip, Napoleon unleashed his Imperial Guard, the Immortals, and they smashed through the Prussian centre. In the chaos of the retreat, Blücher did something that defines the grit our ancestors valued so highly. He led a desperate cavalry charge himself. His horse was shot out from under him, and the 72-year-old general was pinned to the muddy earth as the French cavalry thundered past, missing him in the dark by mere inches. His aide-de-camp covered him with a cloak to hide his medals. When he was finally rescued, bruised, battered, bruised, battered, and smelling of the rhubarb and gin he used to numb the pain, his officers expected him to order a retreat back to Germany. If he had done that, Wellington would have been doomed. Napoleon would have had a clear path to crush the British alone. But this is where the rotten wedge failed. Instead of retreating east toward his supply lines, Blücher made a decision that changed the course of European history. He ordered his army to march north, toward Wavre. He was keeping the promise he made to Wellington. He was staying within supporting distance. Meanwhile, at the crossroads of Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney, the man Napoleon called the bravest of the brave, was having a tactical meltdown. Ney had been humbugged by his own caution. He hesitated, allowing Wellington to feed reinforcements into the crossroads just in the nick of time. The British 92nd Highlanders and the Black Watch stood their ground in the tall rye fields, dying in their hundreds to hold that patch of dirt. To put the importance of these crossroads into a modern context, imagine the M1 and the M25 being blocked during a national emergency. If Ney had taken Quatre Bras early, Wellington's army would have been paralysed, unable to move his artillery or his supplies. It was the logistical heart of the campaign. By the night of the 16th, the situation was a mess for everyone. The Prussians had been defeated at Ligny, but they weren't broken. Wellington had held at Quatre Bras, but he was now dangerously exposed. When the Duke heard that Blücher had been forced back, he knew his position was untenable. He had to retreat. And then, the heavens opened. The rain on the 17th of June wasn't just weather, it was a protagonist in this story. It turned the roads into rivers of liquid chocolate. The British retreat toward the ridge of Waterloo was a nightmare of mud and thunder. Napoleon, sensing victory, personally led the pursuit, his carriage splashing through the muck as he screamed at his gunners to hurry up. But the mud was the great equalizer. It slowed the French Grand Battery. It exhausted the horses. It gave Wellington the time he needed to find his ground. He chose a long, low ridge just south of the village of Waterloo. He'd scouted it a year earlier. He knew every dip, every hedge, every farmhouse. Napoleon thought he had driven a wedge that would shatter the alliance. He thought he had left Blucher for dead in the mud of Ligny. He believed he was chasing a beaten sepoy general into a trap. But as the Prussian army marched north through the rain and the British Redcoats settled onto the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, the wedge was no longer splitting them apart. It was drawing them together into a vice. The Emperor was confident. He was the master of Europe. But as he sat in his farmhouse that night, drying his boots, he didn't realize that the old lion was already licking his wounds and checking his watch. The 18th of June was coming, and the ground was finally ready. In the high-stakes world of 19th century warfare, the greatest enemy wasn't always the man with the bayonet. Sometimes it was the ground beneath your feet. On the morning of June 18, 1815, the fate of Western civilization rested on a single tactical variable: mud. Now, to a modern audience, rain might seem like a mere inconvenience. You put on a mac, you open an umbrella. But for a Napoleonic army, a summer deluge was a logistical catastrophe. To understand the logistics of mud, you have to understand the Grand Battery. Napoleon was an artillery officer by trade. His entire tactical doctrine was built around softening the target with massive, concentrated cannon fire before the infantry moved in. But a 12-pounder brass cannon weighs over a ton. In the 1815 Belgian countryside, there were no paved roads. There was only packed earth. When the heavens opened on the 17th, that earth turned into a viscous, sucking porridge. Imagine trying to drag a grand piano through a swamp while people are shooting at you. That was the reality for the French gunners. Napoleon looked out at the waterlogged fields on the morning of the 18th and made a decision that would haunt historians for centuries. He delayed. He waited for the ground to dry so his machinery could maneuver. He waited until 11 a.m. Those lost hours were the most expensive hours in French history. Every tick of the clock was a mile closer for the Prussians marching from the east. While the French were struggling with the muck, Wellington was using the terrain to his advantage. He didn't just pick any ridge, he picked one with a reverse slope. This is a masterclass in tactical geometry. By positioning his men just behind the crest of the hill, he made them invisible to the French gunners. More importantly, the mud fundamentally changed how the weapons worked. You see, in the 1800s, cannonballs didn't usually explode. They were solid iron spheres. The killing power of a cannonball came from it hitting the ground and bouncing, skipping through ranks of men like a stone across a pond. But on June 18th, the ground was a sponge. When the French Grand Battery finally opened up, their shots didn't bounce. They simply went thud, burying themselves harmlessly in the Belgian clay. To give you a modern comparison, it's like a world-class football team trying to play a Champions League final on a pitch that has just been flooded. All their technical skill, all their tactical drills, they all go out the window because the balls simply won't roll. The mud was also the nemesis of the cavalry. A horse charging at full gallop is a terrifying force of nature, but a horse struggling through knee-deep mire, it's a sitting duck. This logistical friction slowed the tempo of the entire French assault, turning what should have been a lightning strike into a slow, agonizing crawl. And then, there was the human element. The logistics of misery. The British Redcoats and their allied counterparts had spent the night of the 17th lying in the open fields. No tents, no fires, just the relentless rain. They were soaked to the bone, shivering, and many were suffering from dysentery. Their muskets, the famous Brown Bess, used flintlock mechanisms. If your powder got damp, your machine was nothing more than a very expensive club. The Duke of Wellington, ever the professional, was obsessed with these details. While Napoleon paced his headquarters, Wellington was seen personally checking the ammunition wagons. He knew that the battle wouldn't be won by grand speeches, but by dry powder and steady boots. So as the bells of the nearby village struck 11, the two armies stood facing each other across 1,000 yards of sodden rye and thick, dark mud. Napoleon had his grand battery in place at last, but the ground had already betrayed him. He had traded time for mobility. In last. But the ground had already betrayed him. He had traded time for mobility, a trade that was about to be cashed in by a 72-year-old Prussian smelling of rhubarb and gin. The logistics were set. The friction was absolute. And now, the Iron Duke was about to show the world why he was the master of the defensive line. The mud had set the stage. The blood was about to fill the gaps. To understand the sheer intensity of Waterloo, you have to stop looking at the map for a moment and look at a single stone farmhouse. Hougoumont. It was a sprawling complex of barns, stables, and a manor house tucked away on Wellington's right flank. The Duke knew its value. He said later that the entire success of the battle turned upon the closing of the gates at Hougoumont. The human hook here isn't a grand strategy, it's a heavy wooden door. The French saw Hougoumont as a distraction. Napoleon's plan was to launch a fake attack to force Wellington to move his reserves away from the centre. He sent his brother, Prince Jerome, with 6,000 men to take the farm. But Jerome, possessed by a dash of Bonaparte arrogance, turned a distraction into an obsession. He threw battalion after battalion into the meat grinder of the Hougoumont woods. Defending this fortress were the men of the Coldstream Guards and the 3rd Foot Guards. These were the elite. These were men who lived by a code of military precision. They had spent the night loopholes into the brick walls, literal holes in the masonry that allowed them to poke their muskets through and fire in relative safety. To the French infantrymen outside, the farm was a volcano spitting fire from every crack and crevice. But around midday, the impossible happened. A massive French officer, a man known as l'Enfonceur, the Smasher, grabbed an axe. Under a hail of lead, he hacked through the north gate. The heavy doors groaned and swung open. About 40 French soldiers, screaming, "Vive l'Empereur!" burst into the courtyard. This was the breaking point. If the French took the courtyard, the farm would fall. Wellington's flank would be turned, and the battle would be over before it truly began. What happened next is the stuff of British legend. Lieutenant Colonel James McDonnell, a giant of a man from the Glengarry Highlands, saw the breach. He didn't call for a retreat. He shouted for a few of his strongest men, including a sergeant named James Graham. In the middle of a literal death match with French bayonets, these men turned their backs to the enemy and used their raw, physical strength to heave the massive wooden gates shut against the surging French tide. They barred the door. The Frenchmen trapped inside. They were hunted down and killed to the last man. Only a young French drummer boy was spared. It was a moment of really visceral hand-to-hand violence that decided the fate of empires. Napoleon continued to funnel troops into this sector. By the end of the day, nearly 14,000 French soldiers were tied up trying to take a farmhouse held by just 2,000 redcoats. Jerome had fallen into Wellington's trap. Instead of draining the British reserves, he had drained his own brother's army. The technical stakes were simple. Hougoumont was an unsinkable anchor. Even when the French brought up howitzers and set the roof on fire, the guards stayed in the burning buildings. They moved the wounded into the chapel because, miraculously, the flames stopped at the feet of a wooden crucifix. To a soldier in 1815, that wasn't just luck, it was a sign. Modern Bridge, in 2015, on the 200th anniversary, a stunning memorial was unveiled at the site. It's a statue of 2 soldiers closing those very gates. Today, you can walk through that same courtyard, and you can still see the musket scars in the brickwork. It costs about £15 to visit, but the weight of the history there is priceless. The Coldstream Guard still carry the closing of the gates as a badge of honour. It was a masterclass in grit. Wellington's right flank had held, but the Ogre was now turning his gaze toward the centre. The feint had failed, but the Ogre was now turning his gaze toward the centre. The feint had failed, so now it was time for the grand hammer to swing. While the fire was still raging at Hougoumont, Napoleon decided it was time to stop poking at the flanks and start smashing through the middle. At around 1:30 p.m., the French Grand Battery 80 massive cannons unleashed a roar that was heard as far away as the coast of England. This was the overture to what historians call the Scarlet Caterpillar. Imagine 17,000 French infantrymen, 4 massive divisions under the command of Comte d'Erlon, forming up in a formation that was almost bizarre. Instead of the flexible columns Napoleon usually favoured, these men were packed into massive, dense blocks. From the British ridge, they looked like a series of thick blue-coated monsters crawling through the rye. But where were the British? The ridge of Mont Saint-Jean looked empty. This was Wellington's signature move, the reverse slope tactic. He had ordered his men to lie down in the tall grass just behind the crest of the hill. For the French soldiers marching forward, it was unnerving. They were climbing a hill toward an invisible enemy, while their own cannons had to stop firing to avoid hitting them in the back. To give you an idea of the technical stakes, a single French column was about 200 men wide and 24 deep. It was a human battering ram. As they crested the ridge, shouting "Vive l'Empereur," they expected to find a broken, retreating army. Instead, Wellington rode along the line and gave a simple, calm command. The British 95th Rifles and the Scottish regiments, the Royal Scots and the Gordon Highlanders, stood up as if rising from the grave. They delivered a volley of musket fire so precise, so really devastating, that the front ranks of the French columns simply vanished. One of the men leading the defence was Sir Thomas Picton. Now, Picton was a character straight out of a Dickens novel. He was a rough, foul-mouthed Welshman who had been wounded at Quatre Bras but kept it a secret. He didn't even have a uniform. He went into the battle wearing a threadbare blue frock coat and a top hat. As the French tried to deploy, Picton roared, "Rally the Highlanders," and led a bayonet charge that stopped the caterpillar in its tracks. In that moment of triumph, a French musket ball struck Picton in the temple. He died instantly, his top hat falling into the mud. He remains the highest-ranking officer to fall at Waterloo. The French were stunned, but they were still numerically superior. The British infantry was starting to waver under the sheer weight of the blue tide. Wellington's line was beginning to bulge. It was at this exact moment, the friction point, that the ground began to shake. Now, if you're a fan of modern cinema, you know that timing is everything. In 1815, timing was life or death. Wellington turned to Lord Uxbridge and gave the order to unleash the heavy cavalry. But before we get to the thundering hooves, we have to recognize the modern bridge. Today, the ground where d'Erlin's men fell is a peaceful Belgian farm. But if you look at the topographical maps used by the British Ministry of Defence today, they still use Waterloo as a case study for line versus column tactics. It's the ultimate proof that a thin line of disciplined fire will almost always beat a massive, disorganized mass. The Scarlet Caterpillar had reached the top of the hill, but it had run out of legs. And as the French infantry looked back toward their own lines, they saw a flash of silver and scarlet appearing over the ridge. The big men on the big horses were coming. The duel was about to move from the musket to the sabre. If you've ever seen the famous painting Scotland Forever, you've seen the myth. A wall of grey horses, manes flying, Scottish Highlanders hanging on to the stirrups, screaming "Scotland Forever" as they gallop into glory. But the reality was far more technical, far more bloody, and far more tragic. It was 2:00 p.m. D'Erlin's infantry was swarming over the ridge. Wellington's centre was in the air. Lord Uxbridge, the cavalry commander, saw the gap and signalled the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade. 2,000 men, 2,000 massive horses. This was the heavy metal of the 19th century. To put it in modern terms, this wasn't a tactical strike, it was a main battle tank charge. The Union Brigade was a unique force. It brought together the 1st Royal Dragoons, the 6th Inniskillings from Ireland, and the legendary 2nd Dragoons, the Royal Scots Greys. These were men on massive mounts, bred for power, not just speed. As they crested the ridge, they didn't just charge, they fell upon the French like a landslide. The French infantry, caught in their dense columns, had no time to form squares. The result was a massacre of the masses. The heavy cavalry didn't just ride past, they rode through. The clink-clink of sabres hitting brass helmets was like 100 blacksmiths working at once. It was during this chaos that Sergeant Charles Ewart of the Scots Greys spotted a golden prize, the eagle of the French 45th Regiment. To a Napoleonic soldier, the eagle was everything. It was the soul of the regiment. Ewart cut his way through the French Guard, hacking down 3 men to seize the standard. Today, you can see that very eagle in Edinburgh Castle. It is a symbol of a moment when the French machine was utterly broken by British grit. But here is where the story takes a dark turn. Cavalry is like a coiled spring. Once you release it, it is incredibly hard to pull back. The British officers, exhilarated by their success, lost their heads. They had shattered Deroland's infantry, but they didn't stop. They kept going. They charged all the way across the valley, their horses blown and heaving, and began attacking the French Grand Battery itself. Napoleon, watching from his chair, saw the great blunder. He whispered, "There's terrible grey horses," then ordered his fresh lancers and cuirassiers to counterattack. Imagine the horror. The British riders were on exhausted horses, their formations scattered. Suddenly, from the smoke, came the French lancers. A man with a 9-foot spear versus a man with a tired horse and a short sword. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. Sir William Ponsonby, the commander of the Union Brigade, found himself stuck in a boggy patch of ground. His horse, a fine beast but completely spent, couldn't move. Ponsonby saw the French lancers closing in. He took out a picture of his wife and a gold watch, handed them to his aide, and was speared through the chest seconds later. Half of the Union Brigade, 1,000 men, were wiped out in less than 20 minutes. This is the nemesis factor of the cavalry. They were the masters of the moment, but their own resolute courage became their downfall. Modern connection: the Royal Scots Greys eventually became part of the Royal Scots Dragon Guards. You might recognise their pipes and drums, they've topped the music charts in the UK, but every time they wear that uniform, they are wearing the memory of the men who rode into the Valley of Death to save Wellington Centre. The charge had saved the day, but at a butcher's bill that made Wellington weep. He had lost his heavy metal. As the remnants of the Greys limped back to the ridge, the valley was a carpet of red and blue. The Ogre had been stung, but he wasn't dead. He looked at the thinning British line and turned to his nemesis, Marshal Ney. The battle was moving into its breaking point. The infantry had fought. The cavalry had charged. Now, it was time for the sabres to meet the squares. Around 4 p.m, the air over Waterloo wasn't just filled with smoke. It was thick with the copper scent of blood and the really deafening thunder of 80 French guns. It was in this chaotic haze that Marshal Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, committed one of the most famous tactical blunders in military history. Ney was a man of fire, not ice. Through his telescope, he saw British wagons moving toward the rear and wounded men limping away. He drew a disastrous conclusion. Wellington was retreating. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't bring up his infantry for support. He simply stood in his stirrups and ordered the heavy cavalry to charge. Imagine the sight. Over 4,000 cuirassiers, the big men, in gleaming steel breastplates and helmets with flowing horsehair plumes, began to trot forward. The ground didn't just shake, it groaned. As they picked up speed into a gallop, they looked like a literal river of steel flowing up the ridge. This was the pinnacle of Napoleonic tactical imagery. The sun catching the polished steel, the rhythmic drumming of 16,000 hooves, the terrifying "Vive l'Empereur" echoing across the valley. But Wellington was a masterclass in staying resolute. He hadn't been retreating, he had merely been tidying his line. As the steel tide surged toward the crest, he gave the order that defines the British infantryman: form square. In seconds, the thin red lines transformed into hollow boxes. 4 ranks deep, the front rank knelt, their bayonets fixed and angled outward like the quills of a scarlet porcupine. The ranks behind stood ready with their muskets. To a horse, a wall of bristling steel is a physical impossibility. A horse will jump a fence, but it will not run onto a spear. The French cavalry reached the top of the ridge, expecting to find fleeing men. Instead, they found a chessboard of impregnable fortresses. For the next 3 hours, Ney led wave after wave of cavalry, eventually totaling nearly 9,000 horses into a circular hell. The French couldn't break the squares, and the British couldn't leave them. The cuirassiers would gallop around the red boxes, hacking fruitlessly at the bayonets with their long sabres, while the British soldiers inside waited for the command. Fire! At such close range, a musket ball didn't just wound, it smashed through steel and bone alike. This is the friction of war. Ney was throwing his best machinery against a wall of pure grit. He had 5 horses shot out from under him. He was covered in mud and gore, screaming like a madman, yet he failed to do the one thing that would have won the battle. He forgot his artillery. Had he brought up even a few light cannons to blast the squares at close range, Wellington's army would have been annihilated. But he didn't. He just kept charging. Modern connection? The square is the ancestor of the modern perimeter defense. Even today, in the age of tanks and drones, the principle remains. If you are surrounded, you create a 360-degree wall of fire. The British regiments at Waterloo, like the 33rd Third, the Duke's own, held their squares with a discipline that felt almost supernatural. One soldier later wrote that the French cavalry were so close we could smell the sweat on the horses and see the desperate look in the riders' eyes. Wellington, ever the expert next door, rode from square to square. He didn't give grand speeches. He just said, "Stand fast, 95th, we must not be beat." What will they say in England? It was the ultimate high-retention drama, men standing in a box, watching their friends die, waiting for the next wave of steel to crash against them. By 6 p.m., the French cavalry was blown. Thousands of horses lay dead or hamstrung in the mud. Ney had burned out the elite of the French army for almost zero tactical gain. But the British were also at their breaking point. The centre was a graveyard of heroes. Wellington looked at his watch, the shadows lengthening over the ridge, and muttered those famous, haunting words, "Either night or the Prussians must come." The Ogre had failed to break the aristocrat with his horses. Now he was reaching for his final, most terrifying weapon. The undefeated, the legendary, the Imperial Guard. The shadows were lengthening over the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, and for the first time in his life, the Ogre felt the cold breath of failure. The Prussians were no longer a rumour. They were a tir-tar, emerging from the dark woods of Hougoumont on his right flank. Napoleon knew he had one card left to play. One move to win it all. He reached for his ultimate reserve, the Imperial Guard. He reached for his ultimate reserve, the Imperial Guard. These were the immortals. To be a member of the Old Guard, you had to have fought in at least 12 campaigns. These men were giants, made taller by their massive black bearskin hats, the very same hats that inspired the uniform of the Grenadier Guards you see outside Buckingham Palace today. They were the most feared troops in Europe. In 20 years of war, the Guard had never been defeated. They didn't just march, they glided across the battlefield with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. At 7:30 p.m., the Emperor saluted them as they passed. 3,000 veterans, marching in columns of divisions, began the long climb up the ridge toward the Allied centre. The French bands played La Victoire est à nous. Victory is ours. To the exhausted, bloody British Redcoats watching from the crest, it looked like the end of the world was coming for them, in blue coats and bare fur. Wellington, however, was a master of the hidden truth. He had one last trick up his sleeve. He had ordered the first foot guards to lie down in the long trampled rye, hidden by the smoke and the reverse slope. They were invisible. The Imperial Guard reached the top of the ridge, expecting to find a vacuum. They thought the British had finally fled. Suddenly, a tall figure on a horse appeared behind the empty ridge. It was Wellington. he looked down at his hidden men and gave the most famous command in military history. "Now, Maitland, now's your time. You parts, now's your time. You parts, and ate 'em." In an instant, 1,500 British guardsmen rose from the earth like ghosts. They were in a line, 4 deep, maximizing every single musket. The French were in a dense column. It was a matter of simple, brutal tactics. The British unleashed a volley that was so really concentrated, it didn't just hit the French, it mowed them down like grass. In the first minute, over 300 of the immortals fell. The fabled Imperial Guard wavered. They tried to deploy, but they were choked by their own dead. Then came the breaking point. The British 52nd Light Infantry, led by Sir John Colborne, didn't just fire, they swung around and charged the French flank. For the first time in history, the cry went up through the French ranks, "La Garde, recule." The Guard is retreating. That cry was the death knell of the Napoleonic Empire. If the Guard could be beaten, anyone could. A wave of panic, a literal, human tsunami, swept through the French army. They broke, they turned, they ran. Wellington, sensing the echo of history, rode to the edge of the ridge, took off his cocked hat and waved it toward the French lines. It was the signal for a general advance. It was the signal for a general advance. Every man who could still walk, British, Dutch, German, and the newly arrived Prussians, surged forward. The Scarlet Caterpillar was now a scarlet avalanche. Only the Old Guard held their ground. They formed squares around the Emperor to allow him to escape. When a British officer called for them to surrender, their commander, General Cambronne, supposedly shouted back a single, defiant word, "Murder," or more politely, "The Guard dies, but it does not surrender." They were cut down where they stood, a resolute sacrifice for a lost cause. Modern bridge? When you see the Grenadier Guards on parade today, they wear those bearskins as a trophy of war. They were granted the right to wear them because they had faced and broken the invincible Imperial Guard. Every time a tourist takes a photo of a sentry at the palace, they are looking at the living legacy of that 10-minute clash on a Belgian ridge. The battle was over. The Ogre was fleeing in his carriage, leaving behind a graveyard of 50,000 men. The sun finally set on the 18th of June 1815, marking the end of an era and the birth of a new world. As the moon rose over the carnage of Waterloo, the world began to change. The silence that followed the final roar of the cannons wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the end of a 20-year nightmare. The Ogre was finally caged. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had reshaped the borders of Europe with a flick of his wrist, was sent to St. Helena, a tiny volcanic speck in the middle of the Atlantic. There, surrounded by the relentless pounding of the waves and British sentries, the man who once commanded millions spent his final days gardening and arguing with his captors. He died 6 years later, but the echo of his genius still rings through every legal code and military academy in the modern world. But what of the aristocrat? Wellington returned to London, not just as a general, but as a titan. He became Prime Minister, a pillar of the Victorian establishment, the Iron Duke in every sense of the word. Yet, he never forgot the butcher's bill. He famously said, "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." To understand the human cost, you only have to look at a morbid modern bridge that most people forget. For decades after 1815, the most expensive dentures in London were known as Waterloo teeth. Thousands of young men had died with perfect teeth, and scavengers spent the nights after the battle pulling them from the corpses to sell to dentists in the city. It's a chilling reminder that the grit of history often has a very dark underside. Waterloo brought about the Long Peace, a period of 40 years where the great powers of Europe finally stopped tearing each other apart. It established Britain as the supreme global power. The master of the seas and the banker of the world. Today, the echo is everywhere. It's in the names of our streets, our pubs, and even our footwear. The Wellington boot was designed by the Duke himself to handle the very mud we've talked about today. But more than that, It lives in the lineage of the British Army. When you see the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards or the Grenadier Guards, you are looking at the direct descendants of the men who stood in those impregnable squares. Waterloo was a near-run thing, won by the skin of our teeth and the iron will of a man who refused to blink. It was a victory of grit over glory, of the expert next door over the imperial deity. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the smoke and the mud. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into our shared history, please ensure you've subscribed and hit that notification bell. We have many more stories to tell, and the next one is just over the hill.